All the gay black artists at Motown were forced to do these disgusting things. Motown gave America joy, elegance, and the soundtrack of a lifetime. But what if I told you that behind those perfect smiles, some of its brightest black stars were forced to live a secret life just to stay famous? Not because of talent, not because of scandal, but because who they were. Offstage didn't fit the clean image Motown sold to the world. Today we're pulling back the velvet curtain on the hidden rules, the staged romances, and the silence that crushed real people. If you're ready for the truth, history often edits out hit, like, subscribe, and stay with legends of black excellence. Motown's birth as a hit factory. Detroit in the late 1950s was a city of steel auto plants and hard borders. Black musicians had talent everywhere, yet their songs were still pushed into the race records corner, shut out of mainstream radio and TV. Into that reality stepped Berry Gordy Jr., a former auto line worker who understood both hustle and systems. In 1959, with $800 borrowed from family, he bought a small house on West Grand Boulevard and called it Hitsville, USA. What began as Tamla became Motown in 1960, and Gordy's goal was bigger than hits. He wanted black music to sit at the center of American pop culture. Gordy didn't build Motown like an artsy label. He built it like the factories he'd watched in Detroit. Songs moved through a pipeline, writers brought ideas, producers shaped them, musicians cut the tracks, and a weekly quality control meeting decided what lived and what died. If a record didn't sound like a sure winner, it went back to the line. In 1961, Gordy created Joe Beat Publishing to keep copyrights in-house, guaranteeing the company's profits and tightening his control over every step from demo to final cut. The artist development department trained performers in diction, posture, choreography, and style, how to speak on TV, how to hold a glass, how to smile on cue, so Motown stars could pass every gate that segregation had once locked. The first proof that this hit factory worked came from Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Smokey was only 19 when his silky tenor and sharp songwriting delivered Shop Around Motown's first million-selling single. Overnight, Gordy had a model for success: raw neighborhood talent refined through discipline packaged for the whole nation. Smokey became a cornerstone of the Motown soundwriting for other acts while fronting his own group, showing that the system could produce both chart success and a recognizable brand. But the same machinery that made Motown unstoppable also demanded total obedience. Long rehearsal days, relentless touring, and thin royalty checks after deductions were part of the deal. And because Motown's clean, family-friendly image was its ticket to white audiences, Gordy's rules reached into private life too. In an era when being gay could end a career, the unspoken command was to hide it and perform normalcy off stage as carefully as on. Motown's birth as a hit factory created legends and the pressures that forced many black artists, especially queer ones, to live behind a mask. Closeted male artists under Motown control. Detroit's glow dimmed sharply for the men inside Motown who lived with a secret the industry refused to tolerate. In the 1960s and early 70s, being gay, especially a black gay man, meant risking not only reputation but livelihood. Motown relied heavily on national television white radio programmers and a carefully curated brand of black respectability. That meant every male artist had to fit a mold: confident, masculine, charming, and unquestionably heterosexual. Inside Hitsville, no executive needed to say it outright. Everyone understood the rule. Rumors could cost bookings. A whisper could kill a single. And so silence became the currency of survival. Billy Preston felt this weight early. A prodigy who played with Ray Charles and would later work with the Beatles, Preston entered Motown as a teenager. His talent made him valuable, but his gentle manner drew unwanted attention from executives. They corrected his posture, his wardrobe, even how he laughed. To calm industry gossip, handlers arranged public appearances with young women, dinners, photos, smiles for the press. Behind the cameras, the pressure to mask his identity carved deep wounds. Years later, long after leaving Motown, Preston spoke of loneliness and spiritual conflict struggles that fed his slide into addiction. For Eddie Kendricks and David Ruffin of The Temptations, the stakes were even higher. The Temptations weren't just a group, they were Motown's flagship image of male perfection. Their choreography was sharp, their suits immaculate, and their appeal depended on their desirability to female fans. When gossip circled around, Kendrick's managers quickly arranged staged romances. Ruffin, already battling ego insecurity and drug use, also felt the scrutiny intensify whenever whispers arose. Both men learned that any deviation from the image could fracture their careers, creating a private world filled with fear, resentment, and secrecy. Behind the scenes, producers Johnny Bristol and Norman Whitfield navigated the same unspoken boundaries. As creators, rather than front stage stars, their reputations traveled quietly through studio corridors. When internal gossip surfaced, they too were guided toward appearances with women at company functions, small, calculated gestures to reassure a conservative industry. Neither man ever publicly confirmed their orientation, but the pressure to fit a narrow idea of safe black manhood hovered, constantly shaping how they moved through the company. These men were not forced into acts of humiliation, but they were forced into erasing parts of themselves. The silence they carried, layered over demanding schedules, low royalties, and relentless public scrutiny, became its own form of violence. Depression, addiction, and emotional collapse were not coincidences. They were the cost of surviving Motown while pretending to be someone the world insisted they had to be. Florence Ballard and the Cost for Women. Florence Ballard walked into Motown as a teenager with a voice that could shake the walls of Detroit. She, Diana Ross, and Mary Wilson began as the Primettes, dreaming of escape from the Brewster Douglas projects and a shot at something bigger. In the early days, Florence was often the powerhouse, the one whose raw gospel fire anchored the group's sound. But Motown was never just about sound. Berry Gordy was building a brand to win over mainstream America, and that brand demanded a specific kind of beauty softness and ladylike polish. As the group became the Supremes, Motown's commercial instincts kicked in hard. Gordy believed Diana Ross, with her lighter, more delicate voice and camera-ready elegance, was the face that could sell records to white audiences and land prime television spots. Florence, fuller-voiced and less easily molded into Motown's finishing school ideal, was pushed to the side. When Where Did Our Love Go hit numb. One in 1964, the spotlight swung decisively toward Diana. Florence's leads dried up her role, shrinking into background harmonies while the world praised a group she had helped build. The pressure wasn't only musical. The Supremes were trained to move, speak, dress, and smile on command. They wore glittering gowns and rehearsed every gesture until spontaneity was wrung out of them. For Florence, this wasn't refinement. It felt like erasure. She watched decisions being made over her head about hair, weight, stage position, and even personality. Off-stage, she sensed the quiet verdict: Motown didn't see her as the future, only as a problem to manage. By 1965, rumors swirled that Gordy wanted to replace her, and the anxiety became corrosive. Florence's frustration collided with exhaustion and humiliation, and alcohol became a way to dull the ache. Tensions with Diana and Motown leadership escalated. Missed performances and visible distress were treated not as cries for help, but as failures against the brand. Motown's machine, so forgiving of profit and so ruthless with weakness, moved quickly. In 1967, Florence Ballard was removed and replaced by Cindy Birdsong, a quieter presence who fit the label's polished image more neatly. Mary Wilson stayed, but the group's original balance was gone. Florence left without real financial security, locked into unfair contracts that offered little protection once Motown withdrew support. Her solo attempts never received the backing given to Diana's rise, and years of struggle followed. In 1976, she died at only 32. A tragedy shaped by personal trauma, addiction, and a system that valued her voice only when it could be controlled. Motown sold glamour, but Florence Ballard paid the price for what that glamour demanded. Marvin Gaye versus the Motown machine. Marvin Gaye entered Motown in the early 1960s with a silky, effortless voice and dreams much larger than the love songs the label wanted from him. Berry Gordy Jr., ever focused on commercial security, saw Marvin as a cornerstone of the Motown sound, smooth, romantic, and safe for mainstream audiences. But Marvin felt the world shifting around him. The Vietnam War, racial unrest, and the anxieties of Black America pressed heavily on his spirit. He wanted to make music that confronted those truths. When he brought Berry the early version of What's Going On, Gordy rejected it outright, calling it too political and fearing it would alienate radio. Marvin, however, refused to bend, entering a silent standoff that revealed the growing rupture between artistic expression and Motown's commercial grip. This tension came during one of the darkest emotional periods of Marvin's life. His deep connection with Tammy Terrell, whose voice blended with his in classics like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, was both musical and spiritual. When she collapsed on stage in 1967 and was later diagnosed with a brain tumor, Marvin fell into profound depression. Her death in 1970 shattered him. At home, his marriage to Anna Gordy Berry's sister was unraveling amid age differences, creative frustrations, and financial strain. Despite selling millions of records, Marvin's royalty rate hovered around 2.7%, and deductions left him often struggling. The emotional weight pushed him toward cocaine, which only deepened the cracks forming in both his mind and career. Yet from this turmoil came the masterpiece Berry finally relented to release, What's Going On Now, considered one of the greatest albums in American music history. Even success couldn't free Marvin from his demons. Lawsuits, tax problems, addiction, and the pressure to outdo his own legacy followed him into the 1980s. He left Motown for Columbia Records hoping for a new beginning, but his personal life spiraled further. In 1984, while living again in his parents' home, Marvin's long-strained relationship with his father turned violent. On April 1st, his father shot him during a heated argument one day before Marvin's 45th birthday. His death became the tragic endpoint of a life defined by genius, suffocation, rebellion, and heartbreak. Motown had elevated him, constrained him, and ultimately remained intertwined with the struggle that shaped both his brilliance and his undoing. Tammy Terrell worked and silenced. Tammy Terrell entered Motown with extraordinary promise, a radiant young singer whose warmth, poise, and emotional clarity made her the perfect duet partner for Marvin Gaye. Beginning in 1967, the two recorded a string of hits that made them Motown's most beloved pairing. Their chemistry felt effortless, and audiences imagined a romance that never existed. Behind that glow, however, Tammy was pushed through an industry built on relentless scheduling. Touring television appearances and long studio hours left her drained. She was only in her early 20s, yet already carrying the exhaustion of someone twice her age. In October 1967, during a concert with Marvin in Virginia, she collapsed on stage, a frightening moment that led doctors to discover the malignant brain tumor that would define the final years of her life. Long before her diagnosis, Tammy had endured emotional turmoil that few fans ever knew. As a teenager, she had briefly worked with James Brown, and in later interviews, her family described incidents of physical abuse during that period, experiences Tammy herself never discussed publicly. After joining Motown, she entered a relationship with David Ruffin of The Temptations. What began with charm soon turned volatile. Friends and colleagues recalled several disturbing episodes, including Tammy appearing with injuries she struggled to explain. These experiences, combined with Motown's demanding pace, created a storm of emotional and physical strain. Marvin Gaye, deeply protective of her later, spoke of the sadness that lived behind her bright smile, even as they continued recording together. After her collapse, Tammy's participation in music became limited. She underwent multiple surgeries and spent long stretches in hospitals. While she was no longer able to perform or travel, Motown still completed the Gaye-Terrell recordings using guide vocals, which Marvin later said he sang to as if she were in the room. Tammy's health declined rapidly, and on March 16, 1970, she died at just 24 years old. Her death devastated Marvin Gaye and marked one of Motown's deepest tragedies. Tammy Terrell's legacy is the shimmering beauty of the music she left behind and the quiet suffering that the public never truly saw. Paul Williams and Temptations breakdown. Paul Williams was one of the founding pillars of the Temptations, a baritone anchor whose disciplined choreography and deep, steady voice helped define the group's earliest success. In the early 1960s, when Motown shaped its male stars into symbols of polished black excellence, Paul embraced the long rehearsals and cross-country tours that slowly built the Temptations into household names. But behind the sharp suits and seamless harmonies was a brutal workload. Some days stretched into 20 hours of rehearsing, recording, and performing. And like many Motown acts, the group earned only a small royalty rate, often around 2.7%, divided among members after deductions. Despite hit records, Paul struggled financially, physically, and emotionally. The pressure to maintain perfection on stage became a quiet torment. By the late 1960s, Paul's health began to deteriorate. He was diagnosed with sickle cell anemia and later with a crippling form of rheumatoid arthritis conditions that made performing excruciating. Yet the show had to go on. Motown's machine didn't pause for illness, and Paul increasingly turned to alcohol to numb the pain in his joints and the growing weight in his spirit. Internal tensions deepened as David Ruffin's unpredictable behavior created conflict within the group, worsening Paul's stress. He felt himself slipping behind as choreography became harder. Breathing became heavier, and the demands of touring became impossible to keep up with. Fellow group members tried to support him, but Motown was a business-first one that tolerated no weakness. By 1971, Paul Williams was forced out of the Temptations, replaced on stage, while still technically kept on payroll to avoid public scandal. Off stage, he spiraled deeper into depression. His finances were unstable, his health was fragile, and he no longer had the identity that had defined his life. On August 17, 1973, Paul was found dead in a car in Detroit, the victim of what authorities ruled a suicide. He was only 34. His death became one of Motown's most heartbreaking shadows, a reminder that behind the elegance and success of the Temptations were human beings carrying burdens too heavy for the spotlight to reveal. Martha Reeves' burnout and escape. Martha Reeves entered Motown with the fire of a young woman determined to rise beyond her modest beginnings. As the lead voice of Martha and the Vandellas, she delivered some of the most electric hits of the 1960s: Heatwave, Nowhere to Run, and the explosive Dancing in the Street. Her voice carried raw soul Detroit grit and a power that cut through the polished Motown sound. Yet behind the surge of fame was a demanding system crafted by Berry Gordy Jr., one that dictated every detail of an artist's life. Martha, like many Motown women, was shaped into a glamorous, refined lady. The finishing school polished her walk, her speech, and even her posture. But it also stripped away parts of her natural, spirited identity. Every smile was practiced, every appearance choreographed, and every moment monitored to maintain Motown's clean, marketable image. The workload that came with this image was punishing. At Motown's peak, Martha and the Vandellas performed a relentless cycle of concerts, television appearances, and studio sessions, sometimes rehearsing or recording up to 20 hours in a single day. Touring schedules left little time for rest, and exhaustion became normal. Despite chart-topping hits, financial returns were far smaller than the fame suggested. After production costs, wardrobe fees, travel deductions, and Motown's tight royalty structure, Martha often brought home shockingly little. The physical strain, combined with the emotional toll of being constantly critiqued by the label, began to wear her down. Martha later described the feeling as being always on trial, as if one misstep could jeopardize the group's future. By the early 1970s, the burnout became impossible to ignore. Martha's voice weakened, her mental health suffered, and she struggled to keep up with the machine that had once lifted her. Motown, now shifting its attention to new stars and new markets, offered little support. In 1972, Martha Reeves finally left the label. Her solo career never reached the same heights, not for lack of talent, but because the emotional scars Motown left behind were deep. She survived the system unlike so many peers, but carried with her the weight of years spent being overworked, underpaid, and molded into someone she never truly was. Martha Reeves endured, but she never forgot the price of Motown's success. Four Tops' success, exploitation, and split. The Four Tops arrived at Motown in 1963 already seasoned and tight as a unit. Levi Stubbs' thunderous lead, the smooth harmonies of Ronaldo, Obie, Benson, Abdul, Duke, Fakir, and Lawrence Payton, and a stage polish that fit Berry Gordy Jr.'s vision perfectly. When I Can't Help Myself. Sugar Pie Honey Bunch exploded in 1965, and Reach Out, I'll Be There followed in 1966. The Tops became one of Motown's most dependable hit machines. They toured relentlessly, selling out theaters and lighting up television screens with a brand of black masculinity that was elegant, romantic, and safe for middle America. On the surface, they were living the dream Motown promised. Behind that dream was the same harsh arithmetic that haunted the label's golden age. Like many Motown acts, the Four Tops worked under contracts that left them with only a thin slice of profits after deductions. Even as their records sold in the millions, their royalty earnings were modest, and the group often had to keep performing simply to stay afloat. The schedule was punishing days stacked with rehearsals, studio time, then another late-night show. Levi Stubbs frequently sang through exhaustion and throat strain, and the constant road life wore on all four men. Motown's finishing school polish demanded perfection every night, whether their bodies could handle it or not. Success kept coming, but so did fatigue, resentment, and the quiet fear of what would happen when the hits slowed. The breaking point arrived in 1972, when Berry Gordy moved Motown's headquarters from Detroit to Los Angeles. For Gordy, it was a leap toward film TV and a broader entertainment empire. For the Four Tops, Detroit wasn't just home, it was their identity and cultural root. Obie Benson refused to relocate and briefly stepped away, a rupture that shook the group's brotherhood. Though they carried on, the move symbolized Motown's shift from soul community to corporate machine. Over the years that followed, the Tops endured losses that felt like the final bill of that era. Lawrence Payton died in 1997 from liver cancer, Obie Benson in 2005 from lung cancer, and Levi Stubbs in 2008 after long illness. Duke Fakir survived, but the story of the Four Tops stands as a bittersweet Motown truth, towering fame built on relentless work, fragile pay, and a system so powerful it could move cities yet never protect the people who made its glory. The Marvelettes, first hitmakers, then forgotten. The Marvelettes should have been treated like royalty at Motown. They were the label's first girl group, and in late 1961, the first Motown act ever to hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 with Please, Mr. Postman. Gladys Horton, Wanda Young, Katherine Anderson, and Jordana Tillman were barely out of high school when they walked into Hitsville, USA, full of hope and talent. Motown's machine quickly turned that hope into a product. The girls were trained to match the company's ladylike blueprint: matching dresses, synchronized smiles, rehearsed steps, and a sweetness designed to charm mainstream America. Their youth made them marketable, but it also made them vulnerable to a system that expected them to work like veterans while paying them like beginners. Success didn't soften the workload, it increased it. The Marvelettes were pushed through non-stop recording sessions and tours that could stretch from early morning rehearsals to midnight performances. Even with follow-up hits like Don't Mess with Bill, their earnings stayed thin under Motown's notoriously low royalty structure, with costs for studio time, choreography, wardrobes, and promotion deducted before paychecks ever landed. Gladys once described holding a check that felt shockingly small beside a million-selling record, an early warning that fame and financial security were not the same thing at Motown. The pressure also strained their health and unity. In 1965, Jordana Tillman, already fragile, was diagnosed with lupus. Instead of slowing down or restructuring with care, Motown replaced her, swiftly treating the group like a slot on a production line rather than four young women with lives. By the end of the 1960s, the glow around the Marvelettes had dimmed, not because their talent faded, but because Motown's attention moved on to newer, more profitable stars. When the hits slowed, support vanished. The group was effectively dropped around 1970, and the members were left to navigate adulthood carrying the physical and emotional costs of their teenage stardom. Gladys tried to continue in music, but never regained the platform Motown once provided. Wanda Young battled addiction later in life and died in 2021. Jordana's illness followed her for decades until her death in 2007. The Marvelettes' story is Motown's first chart-topping triumph and one of its earliest examples of how quickly the machine could celebrate exhaust and then forget the very artists who built its legacy. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles worn down. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles were not just early Motown stars, they were the proof that Berry Gordy Jr.'s new hit factory could work. When Smokey Claudette Rogers, Bobby Rogers, Ronnie White, and Pete Moore entered Hitsville as teenagers, their harmonies felt effortless, but their success was engineered through Gordy's system. Shop Around became Motown's first million-selling single around 1960, a breakthrough that helped define the label's future. From that moment on, Smokey was treated like a cornerstone of the Motown sound, a frontman, a songwriter, and a producer who could deliver a hit on demand. Gordy leaned on him heavily, not only for the Miracles records, but for songs that fueled other Motown acts, making Smokey both a star and a worker on the assembly line. But being central to the machine meant living inside its rules. Motown's artist development discipline shaped Smokey's image into the perfect, non-threatening black gentleman for mainstream America. Every suit, every stage move, every public appearance had to fit the brand. As the 1960s progressed, industry gossip about Smokey's private life, including unconfirmed rumors about his sexuality, added another layer of pressure. Nothing was ever publicly proven yet in that era. Even whispers could be dangerous. The expectation was simple: protect Motown's clean family story at all costs. Under that strain, Smokey carried a double load writing, recording, touring, and maintaining a flawless public persona while watching royalty checks that rarely matched the scale of his success. After deductions typical of Motown contracts, the Miracles' earnings stayed far lower than their chart power suggested, reinforcing the sense that the company owned not only the music, but the people making it. By 1972, exhausted and craving artistic breathing room, Smokey stepped away from the Miracles. The group tried to continue, but without the voice and pen that defined them, their momentum faltered. Motown's machine, always chasing the next dependable hit, gradually shifted attention elsewhere. The Miracles disbanded in 1978, and members faced uneven futures, some dealing with financial hardship and fading recognition. Smokey went on to solo success, yet he later described Motown with bittersweet honesty, a beautiful dream that could become a nightmare. Their story shows a hard truth at the heart of the label's golden era. If even its most loyal architect could be worn down by control, silence, and endless demand, then no one in Hitsville was truly safe from being ground by the machine they helped build. Stevie Wonder fights for freedom. Stevie Wonder entered Motown in 1961 as Little Stevie, an 11-year-old prodigy whose harmonica and voice seemed almost supernatural. Berry Gordy Jr. immediately understood the commercial gold in a blind black child who could make America smile, and Motown wrapped Stevie in a tightly controlled image. Bright suits, cheerful lyrics, and a wholesome baby-faced persona designed to charm white television audiences. When Fingertips Pink 2 shot to #1 in 1963, the label had its miracle child, but also a new asset to manage. Stevie's music, stage presence, interviews, even his public story were carefully steered to fit Motown's safe family brand. Like many young artists at Hitsville, he was expected to be grateful, obedient, and endlessly productive. The problem was that Stevie grew up. By the late 1960s, he was no longer content to be a mascot within Gordy's hit factory. He wanted to write produce and experiment beyond Motown's formula. At the same time, he began to learn how the business actually worked. Motown's contracts placed tight control over publishing and royalties in the company's hands, and artists often received only a small percentage after deductions. When Stevie turned 21 in 1971 and finally gained access to his finances, he discovered that the trust fund built from a decade of hits was far smaller than he believed it should be. That moment wasn't just a financial shock, it was a personal awakening. For a label that demanded artists hide anything that threatened its polished image, whether sexuality, anger, or creative rebellion, Stevie's insistence on freedom was its own kind of defiance. Instead of retreating, he pushed harder. Stevie renegotiated his contract in the early 1970s, demanding creative control, a better financial arrangement, and the right to shape his own sound. The result was a historic run. Music of My Mind, 1972. Talking Book, 1972. Inner Visions, 1973. And Songs in the Key of Life. 1976. Redefined soul and pop, proving that a Motown artist could be both commercially massive and artistically untouchable. Stevie later described Motown as a tough school, one that taught him discipline but also tried to limit his voice. He survived by refusing to stay small. In a system where silence was often the price of success, Stevie Wonder became a legend by speaking through music exactly as himself. The Detroit to LA move and decline. By the early 1970s, the Motown miracle was starting to crack, not because the music had lost its spark, but because the company had drifted away from the very soil that made it grow. Berry Gordy Jr. believed the next chapter had to be bigger than records, so in 1972 he moved Motown's headquarters from Detroit to Los Angeles, chasing film, television, and a Hollywood-style empire. But Detroit wasn't just a mailing address. It was the label's heartbeat. The musicians who lived nearby, the gospel and blues air in the streets, the humble Hitsville, USA house, where artists felt part of something shared. In LA, Motown became more corporate, more scattered, and less connected to the community that once held it together. The move didn't just change geography, it thinned the soul of the operation, and many artists felt it immediately. As the spirit faded, the business tensions that had always simmered turned into open fractures. Stevie Wonder, after discovering how little control he had over his earnings and master recordings, fought for creative and financial freedom. His push symbolized a new generation refusing to be managed like factory parts. Diana Ross, Motown's brightest commercial star, eventually left in 1981 for RCA, seeking full creative authority and a deal that reflected her true value. Marvin Gaye also walked away that same year, exhausted by years of artistic battles, low royalties, and the emotional weight Motown's system had added to his life. Even earlier artists like Martha Reeves, the Four Tops, and the Marvelettes had felt what it meant to be celebrated while profitable and sidelined once the hits slowed. Their stories became quiet warnings inside the company. Loyalty did not guarantee protection, and success didn't guarantee fair reward. The departures hit Motown like body blows. Each exit was not only the loss of a superstar, but a public exposure of the label's core weakness, its habit of controlling talent more than nurturing it. As disco, rock, and newer R&B sounds took center stage, Motown struggled to keep pace. The Los Angeles studio that was meant to signal reinvention often felt empty compared to the buzzing Detroit house it replaced. Revenue slid, costly film ventures underperformed, and debt mounted. In 1988, facing financial pressure and a changing industry, Berry Gordy sold Motown to MCA for about $61 million, closing the book on a label that had once reshaped America. Motown's decline wasn't just a business story, it was the final consequence of a machine that lost sight of the artists who gave it life. Jackson 5. Exit and late-era struggles. When the Jackson 5 burst onto the scene in 1969, they became Motown's miracle revival. Michael Jackson, only 11, was a phenomenon, and with his brothers, the group delivered a streak of #1 hits unmatched by any new act of the era. Berry Gordy Jr. quickly shaped them into a polished, family-friendly package designed to charm white television audiences while keeping tight control over every note they recorded. But success did not equal freedom. Motown owned their publishing, chose their songs, and dictated their sound. As the boys grew older, especially Michael, they wanted more artistic input, writing, producing, and exploring a broader musical palette. Motown refused. Combined with contracts that kept them earning far less than their cultural impact, suggested the tension reached a breaking point. In 1975, the Jackson brothers made the bold decision to leave Motown for Epic Records, where creative control and better financial terms awaited. Only Jermaine Jackson stayed behind, both because he was married to Berry Gordy's daughter and because he believed in Motown's legacy. The departure was a devastating blow. The Jackson 5 had become global icons, and losing them exposed Motown's growing inability to retain its most bankable stars. Michael's rise at Epic, eventually becoming the most successful entertainer in history, proved exactly what the brothers had been seeking: the chance to create music on their own terms. Motown, meanwhile, struggled publicly. Gordy attempted to position Jermaine as the next major solo act, but without his brothers or Motown's earlier momentum, the magic was never the same. Desperate to correct course, Motown turned to new talent, and Rick James emerged as the label's late-era bright spot. His 1981 smash Super Freak brought Motown back onto the charts with a bold, funk-driven reinvention. But even Rick's success couldn't mask the structural problems beneath the surface. Older contracts that alienated artists, a disconnect created by the move to Los Angeles, and a roster losing stars faster than it gained them. Without the Jackson 5, Motown's ability to compete in a rapidly changing musical landscape faded. The label that once defined American pop now struggled to keep pace, and its attempts at reinvention felt too late. Jackson 5's departure wasn't just another artist exit. It was the moment Motown's decline became impossible to ignore, marking the beginning of an era the company could never fully recover from. Final reckoning: Motown's human cost. Motown began as a dream. Berry Gordy Jr.'s vision of giving black talent a platform powerful enough to break racial barriers and reshape American music. And in many ways it succeeded. Stevie Wonder fought his way to creative freedom. Diana Ross became an international icon, and Smokey Robinson helped craft the very foundation of the Motown sound. Yet beneath the glittering legacy lay a far harsher truth. Motown's assembly line structure demanded total obedience, polished images, relentless schedules, and contracts that favored the company over the artists who fueled it. Florence Ballard, once the soul of the Supremes, died in poverty after being pushed aside. Tammy Terrell collapsed under the weight of illness and non-stop work, passing at just 24. Paul Williams of the Temptations spiraled into illness and depression until his tragic death. Marvin Gaye, long embattled by artistic fights and emotional turmoil, was killed in the midst of a life already scarred by Motown's pressures. These losses were not isolated tragedies. They were the human cost of a system that valued perfection more than people. While some, like Wonder and Ross, emerged with lasting success, many carried deep emotional wounds from years of enforced image control, financial imbalance, and the expectation to stay silent about pain, identity, or injustice. Motown's rise changed America, but its shadow reminds us that brilliance can be exploited, ambition can overreach, and even the greatest music can come from artists struggling beneath enormous strain. In the end, Motown stands both as a triumph of black creativity and a cautionary tale of how an empire built on dreams can become a machine that breaks the very hearts that made it shine. So when we celebrate Motown as the crown jewel of black music, we should also ask what that crown cost the people who forged it. Was the silence demanded of queer artists simply survival in a cruel era, or a deliberate business choice that traded human dignity for crossover dollars? And if that was the bargain, then what bargains are still being made? Now just with better PR. At Legends of Black Excellence, we honor the brilliance, but we don't dodge the shadows. Tell me, does greatness excuse the pain or demand reckoning today? Drop your view below and challenge mine.